Rocket Riders of the 27th Century proudly brings to you A Rite of Passage, a short story about First Officer and Chief Mechanic Ensel's participation in his native Martian ritual before leaving Mars to join the service. Written by Michael Moreau, read for you by Mark Roddy. I knew letting you run off to Titan and study with those human missionaries was a terrible idea. If I could, I'd give myself a good solid kick up the backside for ever permitting it. The elder Martian's face was even harsher than his words. His son cringed. From what he'd seen of human families, it was generally no longer considered acceptable, at least in the culture of Titan, to use corporal punishment against your children. But on Mars, it was not only acceptable, it was mandatory. Martian children were, humans would use the word, rambunctious. Later in life, Martians tended to mellow drastically, but Ensel's father was still young enough himself to have a bit of mean streak left. He braced himself for the back of his father's hand, but it did not come. "You wince as though you expect me to strike you, Ensel," his father stated, then shook his head. "During the rotations that you've been gone, I've passed Goran Fall." Goran Fall was equivalent to a Martian midlife crisis. "My temper is not what it used to be." He suddenly turned his gaze back at his son, some fury still remaining despite any life change he may have gone through. "That does not mean I am happy with you." Ensel, clad in his chap-like leg coverings made from the fur of the gilda, a large burrowing rodent that served as a primary food source for his people, hung his head in shame. He felt that even if he had not spent time amongst the humans, the rite which he was about to be forced to go through would have been something he would have found objectionable. The young Martian had a remarkably mellow and jovial nature which was a rare trait amongst his people. Sure, the elders were as tranquil as stones, but usually at his age, a Martian, especially a male, had a bit more fire in his belly. "All of those hundreds of years ago when those first humans set their boots upon Martian soil, our great-great-grandfathers should have bashed their helmets in with stones and let them taste sweet Martian air." As soon as the words had escaped his mouth, Elik's expression changed to one of shame. It seemed as though at least some of the brashness of his youth still remained in the man. "I'm sorry." He looked at his son, clearly embarrassed. "The humans have taught us great many things, which we should be thankful for. Only, I wish they hadn't taught you quite so much, my son." The first humans to set boot on Martian soil hadn't encountered any of the native Martians. It wasn't until their fourth expedition that one of their survey teams picked up strange seismic readings near what they had assumed to be an extinct lava tube. When they dug up the first tunnel, they had been lucky to encounter a group of terrified elders trying to tap into an aquifer with iron tools. The sudden influx of sunlight into where they had been working rendered them nearly blind. After a quick settling of dust, they were confronted by raspy-breathing aliens in what appeared to be nothing other than heavy battle armor. Worse still, the humans had bright exploration lights mounted to their helmets, and it must have seemed to those first Martians that they were some kind of terror from beyond, well aware of their enemy's sensitivity to light. And to be perfectly fair, those humans were every bit as startled. At that point in their history, save for a brief encounter with an unidentified craft in the proximity of Neptune, human beings had never encountered alien life. No doubt those astronauts, which is what they were called at the time, must have nearly hyperventilated in their suits when their digging had unearthed a group of subterranean creatures that looked very similar to themselves, yet distinctly alien. At the time, they would not have known their luck. Future explorers and diplomats would, however, understand the peril they could have been in had they broken in upon a group of young Martian males out on a hunt. Blinded they might have been, but they would have struck out with whatever primitive implements they had been carrying, and history would have played out very differently. Would the humans have struck back? Would they have left the red planet alone for fear of hostile natives? Or would they have taken upon themselves to try and tame the savages, even if that meant using force? Luckily, things did not play out that way. Those first three humans, though scared as witless as their alien counterparts, managed to compose themselves and simply keep their distance, but did not back away. Noticing the elders covering their eyes, they shut off their lights and assumed non-threatening postures. No one knows how long both groups, humans and Martians, sat there in uncomfortable silence before an elder, remembered in history books as a Shuk, extended a hand in friendship. At least that's what the books say. Perhaps it was merely a hand of curiosity. He stretched out his arm and touched the gloved hand of one of the astronauts who had done the same. With a little goading, the humans were eventually convinced to follow the elders down into the tunnels. The historical records were not terribly detailed in what happened next, but it was a foregone conclusion that the elders calmed all of the others and prevented the rash young males from doing anything that would have resulted in tragedy. The story goes that a Shuk, so intrigued by the humans, was later given one of their helmets to shield his eyes from the bright sunlight and led back to their rocket where he could see how they had come to his world. It also states that his son, a Shun, volunteered to return to Earth with them and that he spent years there, being for the humans what a Shuk was for them on Mars, an ambassador. No modern Martian could deny that contact with humanity had been anything but a blessing for them. 100 millennia before humans had begun to build the Great Pyramids, Martian society thrived. At the time, Mars still had a small remnant of magnetic field, and the air was slightly thicker. The surface was still parched, and Martians had already become a part-time subsurface dwellers long before their recorded history, but they could at least venture onto the surface and hunt the few remaining creatures that filtered the arid soil for moisture and bacterial sustenance. Those ancient Martians developed language and writing and even reached a technological apex that rivaled the world of the Italian Renaissance, but it was not to last. The same forces that had driven them long ago into spending much of their lives below the surface only intensified. What remained of the planet's weak magnetic field collapsed completely and the air became even thinner. Life on the surface, other than very brief expeditions, became impossible. By the time that humans were inventing the wheel, Martian society had degenerated into something akin to the Stone Age. Sure, they still knew how to work with metals like bronze and iron, but they reverted to tribal societies and their way of life was slowly becoming more and more unsustainable. The massive underground network of tunnels that once linked the great cities began to crumble as population shrank and no longer cared to repair them. Gradually their society became disconnected and only small pockets of Martians clung to life, hunting what creatures still lived in the subsurface tunnels and finding what deposits of ice they could melt for drinking water. The re-exploration of Mars would fascinate an entire generation of humans and Martians alike. Archaeologists, fast running out of places to dig on Earth, found a treasure trove of antiquity beyond belief in the tunnels of the Red Planet. Old tunnels were opened. Ancient cities, long lost to the Martian people, were dug up and amazed both species at their splendor. Tribes began to connect with other tribes from whom they'd been separated for so long that each thought the other to be no more than a legend. Mars began to come alive again as human technology found ways to access deeper deposits of ice and subsurface aquifers larger than anything the native Martians could have ever imagined. Caverns were turned into biospheres, and life, which had slowly been fading away, returned in full force to the Red Planet. Martian life in the 27th century was every bit as modern as any other industrialized world. The surface had been terraformed to allow their human brethren to exist upon it without the need for pressure suits or oxygen masks. Most natives, however, still preferred to live below the surface. It was the niche they had evolved to fit into. A new network of tunnels so vast they covered the entire planet had been built. Those ran alongside the old tunnels so that their history could be preserved, but a few villages, they were no longer called tribes, still lived in some of the old tunnels. While the new network was modern, with schools and shopping centers and every form of modern convenience, those who lived in the old network were considered backwards and not up with the times. Outliers, they were called, by those who lived in the modern cities. At a young age, Ensel had ventured into New Shaxol, named in reverence for the ancient and glorious city of the ancestors, to purchase medicine for his ailing grandmother. The human condition known as measles had mutated on the Red Planet and was a frequent killer of the old and the weak, at least without modern medical treatment. They had visited Ramash, a large nearby village, on several occasions, so auto wagons were nothing new to the young Martian, but monorails and sky cars of the big city awed him so thoroughly that it was all he could talk about for weeks upon their return home. As an adolescent, Ansel took to sneaking off as frequently as he could, any chance to see the city and the wonders it held. Anytime anyone in the village needed an errand run, he would volunteer and would spend hours at the city's massive central library learning about the grand universe that existed outside of the tunnels. He knew that his destiny lay out there, amongst the stars, yet he had never seen them with his own eyes. It had taken weeks of pestering, but eventually he convinced his father to let him go to the surface. Chaperoned, of course. Elik deeply disliked the surface. With all of that sky above him, he felt as if any moment everything could turn upside down and he would fall off of the planet and into the abyss. It made him terribly dizzy. But his son had pleaded. Though it was extremely disconcerting the first time, Ensel's discomfort was quickly replaced by wonder. They'd ventured up at night, of course, where their sensitive eyes could see the true grandeur of the Milky Way galaxy and all of the stars she had to offer. Ensel could have stayed there all night, completely transfixed by what he saw. It was like the largest cavern he had ever seen, but with a mural affixed to its ceiling so grand that only the great creator himself could have painted it. Elik found it interesting, but not as much as his son. He had drugged the boy back into the tunnels after only a few hours. Several years later, he'd been furious when Ensel had announced that he was going to attend a technical school in New Shaxel. He fought tooth and nail to keep his son where he thought he belonged, in the village. Alas, even his own wife, Marish, was against him. It had all come to a head with a large argument that resulted in Ensel leaving early for the city. He and his father did not speak again for nearly 2 rotations. When Ensel told him of his plans to visit Titan to continue his education, Elik had wanted to become furious with his son, but he knew that it would do no good. It would only drive him further away. With a quick hug and a few words of encouragement, he'd seen his son off, the first of their family to ever leave Mars. The 2 rotations that he'd been scheduled to be on Titan turned into 3, and when he returned, Elik, Marish, and his brothers and sisters barely recognized Ensel. Trax, his Urumish, or half-brother, had been the only one to seem truly interested in learning about what he'd seen off-world. Most of the others simply smiled, hugged him, and went on about their business. They wanted to know how he was, but cared little for the outside world. It took some time, several weeks, to build up the courage to tell them that he intended to join the service. Many Martians did. Those who lived in the big cities or even in the above-ground human cities, but very few outliers ever left planet, let alone join the service. His father was very angry, of course, and his mother pleaded with him to stay, but later came around and told him to do whatever made him happy. She came to him one evening and said that she had been selfish, that he should live the life he wanted to and not let his father sway his decision. She did insist, however, that he take part in the Kira Kira before he departed. Elik had already made it clear that he did not approve of his son's choice, but that he absolutely would not be allowed to leave if he did not first participate in the ancient rite. It was an outdated ritual. In times past, before humans had come to the Red Planet, populations were small and maintaining genetic diversity was important. Therefore, before choosing a life mate for her primary family, every female was expected to bear one child by a male from a neighboring village. She was allowed to choose any 2 sexually mature males she desired, and they would participate in the Kira Kira to see which of them was the strongest, and therefore would be the most suited to pass on his genes. Trax was the result of his mother's Kira Kira, so despite his feelings on the matter, his family insisted that Ensel participate and father a Chemish, or half-child, before he left the planet. "This," Elik spoke as he reached into a cloth satchel, "is yours. I had it made by a craftsman on Ramash. He said it came out exquisitely, one of the best he's ever made." From the bag he pulled a medium-sized knife with a curved blade somewhat in the shape of a lightning bolt. "Are you sure he wasn't just trying to get a higher price for it?" Ensel chuckled. He was trying desperately to mask the anxiety and frustration with his humor. His father walked closer and put his hand on his son's shoulder. "Ah, Ensel, you try to hide so much with your joviality. You're a lot like your mother." Ensel smiled at the compliment. Elik adored his wife, and to be compared to her was an honor. She was a kind and gentle, yet strong woman. "A few rotations ago I could never have said this to you, but I am very proud of you." Ansel looked up, surprised by the now tranquil look on his father's face. "Oh, I am not happy about your decision to leave. I'll make no pretense of that. But you are intelligent and capable and gifted with the natural ability to stand tall in the face of danger. I sense a great strength in you that none of my other children possess. Something I would never say in any other setting, of course, as I love each of you equally." The younger Martian dropped his typical humor for a moment and looked up into his father's eyes, then placed a hand on his shoulder. "You honor me, Father. I know that you've only wanted a good life for me. You may not have chosen the path I'm going to take, but know that I will carry your strength with me wherever I go. And I want to make you and Mother and our entire village proud." With that, he reached out and took hold of the Cossack blade. He'd held one before. Trax's, in fact. The smith had not lied about the quality of this particular knife. It felt much more balanced than the one his Urumesh possessed. The Cossack blade was designed to be a razor sharp, so it would require only the slightest bit of pressure to cut. The point of the Kira was not to kill one's opponent, but to be the first to inflict 3 cuts upon him. 3 marks that signified defeat. The fight was to be held in Ramosh, where the young girl Dariska hailed from. A large gathering of friends and relatives had turned up in the central courtyard of her family's rather lovely estate. It wasn't until entering the circle that had been drawn on the brick paving stones that Ansel finally got to see who he would be matched against. It was Terrace, a stocky young Martian who'd given him quite a bit of hell in primary school. The Kira was looking better all of the time. Not only was Dariska a lovely specimen of a young female, but giving Terrace, his old bully, a few scars, held a certain appeal. Still, he couldn't help but wonder why the girl would have chosen the 2 of them. Were her tastes in males that drastically varied? Sure, Terrace was decently handsome, but he was also a buffoon. He supposed she did not know him well enough to have figured that into her selection. Elik extended a bag full of chalk for Ansel to dip his hands into. Dry hands held onto a knife better than sweaty ones. Terrace's father did the same for his son. Each of the men grasped their Cossack blades and stepped into the circle. The crowd was split down the middle, half chanting Ansel's name, half chanting the name of his rival. A moment later, as Dariska walked into the circle, the chanting began to drop in volume. "Ansel, son of Elik, Terrace, son of Fagrel," she addressed them. "I have chosen one of you to be the father of my first child. Which one of you that will be is up to you. He who is most worthy will bear the honor of contributing to the continuation of our people. May you both fight with honor." The words were as old as time. She recited them perfectly just as she'd been taught. From the pocket of her robe she pulled a small piece of cloth and raised it high into the air. "When this cloth falls to the ground, you shall meet in ritual combat. He who receives 3 marks upon his flesh must depart with grace and dignity. Are you prepared?" Both men nodded their agreement. Ansel gritted his teeth and stared Terrace directly in the eyes. He knew he was not as aggressive as the typical Martian male, but this was a special case. His family would keep him on Mars until he sired a Chemish. And besides, Terrace had it coming. Dariska released her grip on the cloth and it slowly began to drift toward the paving stones. In the light Martian gravity, wind resistance was enough to keep it aloft for several seconds. Both men, hands at their sides and ready to draw their Cossack blades, watched as it wafted slowly through the air. Time seemed to slow. Seconds ticked by in time with their hearts beating in their ears. Ansel spied Terrace reaching for his blade slightly before the cloth and made contact with the stone, but he did not flinch for risk of being disqualified. Terrace's blade was already half drawn by the time the cloth truly touched the ground, but Ansel was still faster than the big brute. In a flash, his blade zinged from its scabbard, and with a quick lunge forward, he dodged the bigger man's wild swing and managed to slice into his forearm. Terrace dropped his knife and clutched at the spot that was now spurting blood. Being ever the fair opponent, Ansel sheathed his knife and waited for Terrace to pick it up. "Retrieve your blade!" Fagrel yelled at his son. As if expecting Ansel to stab him in the back while he was not looking, Terrace dove for the Cossack blade. He made a fool of himself as he lay upon the ground, wheeling his blade out in front of him, as if Ansel would jump on top of him like a wild animal. Ansel merely stood at the opposite end of the circle and stared at him like he was mad. The crowd erupted into laughter at Terrace and only further enraged the bully. He pulled himself to his feet and yelled at them, "Stop laughing!" His words fell on deaf ears. Ansel even caught a glimpse of Deriska looking at Terrace distastefully. "Terrace!" Ansel gave a clear warning before lunging forth again. His toe turned to face him, but wasn't fast enough. Ansel's blade made a clear cut across the bigger man's chest. Expecting an immediate reaction, he was taken aback when Terrace just stood there, stunned. He reached down and felt the blood oozing from his fresh wound. Then there was a flash of anger in his eyes, and the expected counterattack commenced. He lashed out wildly. Ansel ducked out of the way of the first swing, followed by another, and then yet one more. Despite the bigger man's lack of skill, Ansel knew that he definitely did not want to get struck with any of his attacks. Terrace was using all of his considerable might, and if his blade was even half as sharp as Ansel's, a hit would result in a very nasty wound. He bided his time, observing. He waited for Terrace to make another swing from the right, and this time he parried his blade, but Terrace recovered faster than he thought the big man capable of, and, instead of swinging side to side, came up with his blade into a stabbing motion. Had Ansel been any slower to react, the blade would have pierced his jaw and lodged itself into the roof of his mouth, or even possibly have penetrated all the way to his brain. Luckily, he was fast enough. He dodged the blow, taking only a small cut to the chin in the process. Deriska had began yelling that Terrace was disqualified for attempting a stabbing blow, but neither of the men paid any attention. The crowd roared as the two sides screamed obscenities at one another. Ansel's eyes flashed with anger, and he dropped down low, spun around the backside of Terrace, and with a single swing left a deep cut from shoulder blade to hip. That was it. 3 cuts. Ansel sheathed his blade and stood tall, waiting for Terrace to submit. He did not. Infuriated, the large man spun around and came at him with his blade over his head, clasped in both hands as if he intended to bury it right into his opponent's chest. Ansel dodged the clumsy downward thrust, then bashed Terrace in the throat so hard with his elbow that the Cossack blade dropped from the man's hands and clanged to the ground. As the battered bully reeled back, clutching at his throat, Ansel flashed him a satisfied smile before he cocked back his right fist and punched Terrace squarely in the face, breaking his nose on contact. Terrace's bulk fell to the ground so hard that Ansel feared some of Deriska's paving stones might be broken underneath him. The crowd instantly went silent. Nobody could believe what they had just witnessed. They had all seen Kira matches get a little rough, but nothing like this. And no one would have guessed that little Ansel would have so thoroughly trounced a known ruffian like Terrace. Ansel glanced over at his mother and father, who were both smiling profusely. He then allowed his gaze to shift over to Deriska. The coy smile she wore and the look in her eyes let him know that his little display had been quite arousing. He definitely had an interesting night ahead of him. The end.